Evening, friends. Tonight, as we speak from the book of Amos, we keep in our minds that the book of Amos has looming in the background the impending doom of Israel as they're going to be conquered by the Assyrians. But before we go any further, we need to do a quick recap of our message from last week from this very book. We largely concentrated on the first two chapters of the book of Amos as we contemplated the idea that the God of righteousness is the God of judgment. We made the point that God was announcing his impending punishment for Israel for their continued violation of the covenant they had with him. God first pronounced judgment on the nations around Israel for the atrocities they had done. God spoke through Amos, a prophet from Judea, touching on these nations in a circular fashion before coming to his people, first Judah, and then in a major way, the great focus of the book is on his judgment of Israel. Both Judah and Israel were castigated for forgetting their covenant with God, and not so much for the specific atrocities they did to their neighbors. The way they acted within their own borders come into focus. It is a judgment against Israel that the book concentrates on. And one by one, the pieces of evidence of their breaking of the covenant with God the pieces were highlighted before he declares that he was going to severely judge them. So what was that evidence? We saw in chapter 1 that they took bribes to deny justice to the poor and the oppressed. They practiced sexual immorality, even teaching their sons to do the same, that is, fathers and sons being involved in the acts together. They used the collateral they accepted as loans as offerings to God. Despite all that God did for Israel to protect them from the injustice of their enemies, they pretended like he was not seeing their own injustice of their people, and they corrupted the priests and holy men, apparently to make pronouncements in favor of their injustice. So last week, we made a point that the God of righteousness is a God of judgment against ungodliness anywhere in the world, because he is really the God of the universe. God's people, however, are coming for a greater judgment just because they are his people. They are a part of his household. And we see in 1 Peter 4:17 where this principle is declared clearly, judgment begins with the household of God. For the Christian who might be worried about the fact that the book of Romans says that God has already meted out judgment on his people through Christ, so there should be no longer any condemnation for them, we said the following: we have been saved for righteousness, not unrighteousness, and that with every action we do, good or bad, there is an inbuilt consequence in keeping with the type of action that it is that we commit. If we do good, good will come. If we do bad, bad will come. The unrighteousness that we do will lead to dire consequences, whether or not God himself is the author of that judgment. And with the teachings of the Bible on this matter, they are extremely clear. We must practice righteousness. If we do wrong, we are to repent and make reparations. If we are wrong, we must be willing to forgive. The longer we take to do the right thing is the more devastating the impact of our wrong on us. So we should keep short accounts with God and our fellow men and do our best to pursue righteousness. In tonight's sermon, we want to concentrate on the prophecies of Amos found in chapters 3 to 6. Here is an overview of just that portion from the Bible Project.
And so the opening of the next section explains why. God says, I chose you, Israel, from among all the families of the earth. This is an allusion to Genesis 12, how God had called the family of Abraham to become God's blessing to all of the nations. And so then God says, so this is why I will punish you for all of your sin. Israel had a great calling, which came with great responsibility, and so their sin and rebellion brings great consequences. Now, this section brings together a lot of Amos's poems, and you'll see a few key themes repeated over and over. So first, he's constantly exposing the religious hypocrisy of Israel's wealthy and their leaders, and he describes how they faithfully attend the religious gatherings, giving offerings and sacrifices, all the while neglecting the poor and ignoring injustice. And Amos says it's all a sham, that God actually hates their worship because it's totally disconnected from how they treat people. God says a real relationship with him will transform a person's relationships. And so Amos's call to true worship is to let justice flow like a river and righteousness like a never-failing stream. Now, these two words, they're super important for Amos and actually all of the prophets. So righteousness, or in Hebrew, tzedakah, refers to a standard of right, equitable relationships between people, no matter their social differences. And justice, or in Hebrew, mishpat, refers to concrete actions that you take to correct injustice and create righteousness. And so both of these are to permeate the life of God's covenant people like a rushing stream fills a dry riverbed. The next theme is Amos's repeated accusations of Israel's idolatry. So remember, when the northern kingdom broke away from southern Judah, their king built 2 new temples to rival Solomon's in Jerusalem, and he placed a golden calf in each. Remember 1 Kings chapter 12. Since then, Israel had only accumulated more idols, worshiping the gods of sex and weather and war. And in the prophet's view, the worship of these gods always led to injustice, because these gods don't require the same degree of justice and righteousness as the God of Israel, not to mention that these gods were immoral themselves. Not the God of Israel, he's different. So he can say in one place, "Seek me that you may live," and then right after that say to Israel, "Seek good, not evil, that you may live." So true worship of the Creator God of Israel, it's synonymous with doing good, with generosity, and with justice. And so the final theme in these chapters is that because Israel and its king have rejected Amos and the other prophets, God will send the day of the Lord. This is a great and terrible act of justice on Israel. And specifically, Amos predicts that a powerful nation will come and conquer and decimate their cities and take the people away into exile. And we know his prediction came true. Some 40 years later, the Assyrian Empire swooped in and did exactly as Amos had said.
Tonight, I'm considering the theme, godly people must do goodly actions. Godly people, goodly actions. Continuing on the ideas of how us serving a God of righteousness, who is the God of judgment, is extremely important in how we act. We want to consider specific actions that the Lord requires of us as we see the prophecies unfold in the book of Amos. Remember, we are focusing on chapters 3 to 6. So the first thing I want to look at is from chapter 3. And the first point is God's people are required to live as positive examples of his righteousness. Look at how the chapter begins. Hear this word, people of Israel. The word of the Lord has spoken against you, against the whole family I brought up out of Egypt. You only I have chosen of all the families of the earth. Therefore, I will punish you for all your sins. Verses 1 and 2 are God's reminder to his people that he chose them, and them only, out of all the people of the earth. But why did he choose them? This is what it says in Deuteronomy 7, verses 6 to 8. For you are a holy people to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his own possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. The Lord did not set his love on you, nor choose you because you were more in number than any other of the peoples, for you were the fewest of all peoples. But because the Lord loved you and kept the oath which he swore to your forefathers, the Lord brought you out by a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery. from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. We must go back to Genesis 12, 1-3 to then understand beyond the fact that God has chosen out of all the people there. Why did God go about choosing a people any at all? We see it in his words to Abraham. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. God was in the business of blessing all the nations of the earth. But among a people that he created the world, who had strayed from his ways and had forgotten him. He needed to start his mission, his earthly mission, somewhere. And he chose Israel for that. This is how he says it through the prophet Isaiah. It is too light a thing that you should be my servant, to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to bring back the preserved of Israel. I will make you as a light to the nations, that my salvation might reach or may reach to the end of the earth. Isaiah 49, verse 6. As representatives of the righteous God of the universe, Israel was to live among the nations in a way that showed forth his heart for them. Unfortunately, that is precisely what they did not do. And the rest of chapter 3 is like what we see of all the chapters, speaking of his impending judgment to them. In chapters 4 and 5, the other two specific charges are made clear. But for now, this is the first charge. You failed to act as my righteous representatives among unbelievers. How can I move on and apply this to us today? I was once at the tax office among a group of people waiting patiently among the hundreds for our time to give to Caesar what was his. At such times when people's patience were thin, the complaints and the histories of other inconveniences came to the fore. One woman spoke out against the treatment at another government place of business that is often as packed as a tax office. And she mentioned the new source of corruption and injustice at that place. She even called the perpetrator by name, the one placed to run the agency. You see, from the day they met that person by the end of that place, is hungry people from them church get promotion. You don't believe me? Go there and look on all of them dressed like them come from that one church. And ask them where them go church. All of them were in charge. Them go a fair church. I do not know if you remember the Jamaican movie, The Harder They Come. Ivan, the bad man here in the story, played by Jimmy Cliff, got a job to work with pastor, doing odd jobs in his yard. He has his eyes on Elsa, a young lady who lives in the pastor's house, perhaps as a boarder along with others. But longer, the other man working in the yard with Ivan sees Ivan's interest in Elsa and he wants him. I see that you have your eye upon pastor cherry tree. Remember, say a pastor plant that cherry tree and I him first to eat from it. Do you get it? The pastor has helped Elsa only because he has an ulterior motive for doing so. Now, I don't know if either of those stories are true. I have no way of knowing if this actually took place. What it does, though, is that it tells us of what often happens in our space where Christians are given a bad name because of what they do in society. Maybe it is just that once you're a Christian, people are going to say bad things about you. But we should do our level best not to make what they say to be true. There are too many confirmed stories of how we have behaved exactly like the message we preach against. And the world is watching and ridiculing us for it. Sadly, because of that, God's name is also blasphemed among the Gentiles, who use our actions to impugn his character. What are the specific charges that Amos highlights in this section of his prophecy? We see this in Amos 4, verse 1. Hear these words, you cows of Bashan and Mount Samaria, you women who oppress the poor and crush the needy, and say to your husbands, bring us some drinks. Let me state what God expects, then explain the verse. God's people are required to seek the well-being of the least before their own comfort. When God calls a woman cows of Bashan, he's not fat-shaming them as some might think. Let's dig into the imagery to get his point. Bashan was renowned for its wealth and abundance. It was a region east of the Jordan River, famous for its fertile land and high-quality livestock. Cows of Bashan were well-fed, strong, and healthy. Here they are used to symbolize abundance and indulgence. By comparing the women of Samaria to the cows of Bashan, God was highlighting their wealth, self-indulgence, and excessive comfort. But how did they get all that? Look at the very second part of the verse. You women who oppress the poor and crush the needy, and say to your husbands, bring us some drinks. The wealth that they enjoyed, they had gained at the expense of the poor. Let us remember the charges from chapter 2. The mighty in the land had accepted bribes to deny justice to the poor. This likely means that in courts of law, because some could pay more than others or some couldn't pay the bribe, justice went to the rich. These same people who provided loans for others and who took their goods as collateral were not slow to sell these for their own profit, and they even had the audacity to go and give that as sacrifice to God. In giving what was not theirs in the first place, they were making no sacrifice to God. It cost them nothing, and so they just continued to get richer while others got poorer. This reminds me of the widow in Mark 12, who gave all that she had to the temple treasury as her offering to God. Read the context carefully. Her house, like those of others like her, was devoured by the religious elite, who then went and put generously into the temple treasury. They, in fact, gave nothing, while she gave everything. But back to those wives, these cows of Bashan. Do you see the other charge? Not only did they benefit from the illicit wealth of their husbands, and they showed it off nicely in their expensive and prosperous looks, but you need to also see the request they made of their husbands while others suffered at their hands. Bring us some drinks. They were pursuing their comforts, gained on the backs of the poor, while the poor suffered. Illicit wealth was being spent for personal comfort, ignoring the many who were robbed to make life so comfortable. This is just like the scammers who throw lavish parties with their flossing, their boastful display of wealth, as they wash their Benzes and Audis with champagne and light their spliffs with $1,000 bills. But get this. In Israel, this was not being perpetrated by outlaws. It was the very ones set up to run a country of righteousness who were the perpetrators. And their wives were lapping up the luxury every chance they got. There is a saying among the Mennonites that God blesses us for the purpose of blessing others. This is likely coming from the very passage we read earlier, where God spoke to Abraham about his promise to him and what he hoped to achieve for the world. So the Mennonites continue. It is not right for me to hoard my blessing while others are out there suffering. In other words, seek the well-being of the least among you before you consider your own personal comforts. I know that this is a hard sell among us today. Everything we have been taught, everything that we have been taught surrounds the notion that it is our responsibility to study, to work hard, get the best jobs, earn as much as possible, build or buy a nice house and home, make a home, and bring up a godly family. Oh, and yes, give to the poor from your excess. I want to suggest that God's way is a tad bit different, friends. And it's a principle that God made clear in his covenant with Israel. I hope we all realize that this is also consistent with the life of Jesus, which we are expected to emulate. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and lay down his life a ransom for many. Mark 10 and verse 45. Let us move on to our final point. God's people are required to pursue justice over and against empty worship. Chapter 5 of Amos begins with an accusation of Israel's hypocrisy. Consistent with the theme of judgment, Amos brings a message of doom for Israel, warning them that because they had fallen, they were going to be stripped of their might and splendor. In an act of reverse decimation, the word is one of extreme calamity. Decimation was a practice of a conquering army lining up enemy soldiers and slaughtering every 10th man. In this way, an enemy army was reduced by 10%. Here, God promises that only 10% of Israel's might and splendor would be saved. But why? Verses 4 to 6 make the charge clear. Let's read it. Seek me and live. Do not seek Bethel. Do not go to Gilgal. Do not journey to Beersheba, for Gilgal will surely go into exile, and Bethel will be reduced to nothing. Seek the Lord and live, or he will sweep through the tribes of Joseph like a fire. It will devour them, and Bethel will have no one to quench it. Do not seek Bethel. Do not seek Gilgal. Do not seek Beersheba. These places had become prominent sites of idol worship in Israel, following on from the tradition of Jeroboam over 150 years before. They had become centers of worship of foreign deities, the Baals and the Asherahs of the day, around whom fertility cults had developed to guarantee worshippers prosperity in their doings. They were gods of sex, weather, and war, and instead of trusting Jehovah, Israel had sold themselves out to these deities. And instead of justice, these deities demanded that which heaped injustice on the poor. You had to participate in temple prostitution to benefit, for instance, or forcibly take from the weak to appease the deity. The worship of these deities brought nothing but trouble on Israel, but in their selfishness, Israel continued with it. God was going to utterly destroy these centers of worship, and so his advice was for Israel to seek God and live. That's verse 6. Now, Amos is very specific that seeking God was not a matter of mere words. Seeking God meant that they also needed to pursue good, setting aside evil. So they were to seek God, do the right thing, and live. Seeking God is the same as doing the righteousness of God. And we see that in verse 14. These are very sober words. Why? Because the prophet is speaking to a very religious people. They were still carrying on their sacrifice in the temple, still following their holy days, pursuing their spiritual disciplines, and singing their songs to God. But in anger, God breathes out a judgmental fire against them. And this is what God says through the prophet. I despise your religious festivals. Your assemblies are a stench to me. Even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. Though you bring choice fellowship offerings, I have no regard for them. Away with the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the music of your harps. But let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never failing stream. Their worship was utterly distasteful to God. It meant nothing because God's people must do godly acts. And worship when you are not doing such is utterly meaningless. Instead, what was required was justice and righteousness. These two related words speak of both God's standard, required standard for his people, that is righteousness, and the concrete actions taken to ensure that such is enacted, justice. Again, these can be seen clearly in how a nation treats the most vulnerable. I want to be sure that you realize that God was not calling for token actions to show that the people were one with him. He wanted justice to flow like a river and righteousness like a never-ending stream. A people dedicated to God and characterized by his way were to consider this as the very essence of their identity. Their devotion to God would not be seen in religious acts, which are nothing but external shows. Instead, it should spring from a heart overflowing with love, inundating everywhere we go and everyone whom we meet. Sadly, what follows in chapter 6 was God's promise of impending doom, which Amos calls the day of the Lord. Israel's comeuppance was at hand. And just 10 years later, it would come to pass when they would be swept away by the Assyrians. I want to apply this message to us now. What is God's word to us today? I think this is something that is already speaking to you as you heard the message. You are already seeing areas of your own life that need to be addressed. Your daily worship is empty and unacceptable if your life is not characterized by the qualities that God expects of his people. I perhaps will say no more on that, except to say that we need to look at everything we do as a part of God's body. And we need to do this to ensure that we are being good representatives of his by the way we live for people, especially the most vulnerable. Why? Because as we have seen in Amos chapters 3 to 6, God's people are required to live as positive examples of his righteousness. God's people are required to seek the well-being of the least before their own comfort. And God's people are required to pursue justice over and against empty worship. Where God's people fail to do that, his judgment is at the door. In Israel, wealth piled high, yet justice was not but a lie. They trampled the poor, ignored God all the more. Now judgment rains down from the sky. Next week, we begin looking more at how that judgment is going to play out. Have a good night.